Thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to Suicide Awareness Month, and also to tell you a little bit about the Listening Place and its work. Before I go into the first slide, I should say that the presentation falls into two parts. The first part is some context around suicide. Now, I'm very well aware that you had a whole month of this. So if you feel that you've heard it all before, find a novel way of flagging it, and I will move through that section quickly. I think you've probably got a wave button somewhere on your waving hand button. A couple of those will give me a clue that I'm in territory with which you're totally familiar, and I'll move on. The second half is really how the charity works and some of the issues that we've found along the way. So my name is Peter Jones, as I've said, and I have been I've been involved with the Listening Place pretty much since its inception 5 years ago. I joined for a couple of reasons. One was that I had been long-term friends with the founders, and secondly, and perhaps more significantly, I lost someone very close to me through suicide, and that gave me the need or the desire to try and help people who find themselves in this very, very difficult place. My role is that of a listening volunteer, and I'll explain what that means a little later on in the presentation, but essentially it means I work with people who have attempted suicide or who are considered at risk of suicide. And I have a second role, which is that as a shift leader, I'm responsible for trying to make the shift run as smoothly as possible. And that means, apart from anything else, making sure that the well-being of both the visitors and the listeners are attended to, because from the listener's perspective, well, let's start the other end. From the visitor's perspective, we know that they are in considerable distress, otherwise they wouldn't be with us. From a listener's perspective, although they are highly trained, 3 50-minute sessions in a shift with someone who is in desperate need can in and of itself be slightly wearing, slightly challenging. So we have to make sure that the needs of both the listeners and the visitors are met. And essentially, what we're trying to do is precisely what it says on this facing slide, which is offer face-to-face support for those who feel that life is no longer worth living. And the important phrase there is face-to-face. We don't do telephone consultations. There are other people that do that very, very well. But the charity was set up specifically to offer face-to-face support, because there is a lot of research that shows that despite the amazing work that can be done by telephone-based system, face-to-face tends to work demonstrably better. Now, inevitably during lockdown, we had to go to a remote service, and we did do telephone consultations, but we're now almost entirely back to face-to-face. And I think there may be a couple of percent where that are still done by phone, but in the main, they're all face-to-face. So this is about providing face-to-face support for those who feel that life is no longer worth living. So let's go on to the next slide. As I say, the first few slides are a little bit about the context for suicide. And as you can see there are 6,500 completed suicides in the UK every year. Now, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable using that kind of terminology. There are 6,500 completed suicides, but of course it is important because it distinguishes between people who have tragically been successful and those who have attempted suicide. And just to give you some context, that is twice the number of people that die from illicit use of drugs, and 3 times the number of people that are killed on our roads. The average is out at 18 a day. The chilling fact is that it is the highest cause of death amongst men under 50, and it's the highest cause of death amongst all adults under 35. It is a real problem. So if we then move on to the next slide, there are certain fictions around suicide. The first is that talking about it prompts the idea. No, it doesn't. Talking about it is actually more likely to reduce the inclination than it is to promote the thought. And someone told me very early on in my association that a long time ago, you would never see signage for Samaritans at railway stations. Now, of course, railway stations are tragically a place that a lot of people choose to try and end their lives. And the idea that it was thought that the idea that you put a sign there about suicide and promoting the Samaritans could actually make the situation worse. Clearly, someone has seen the error, because now in many, many stations, certainly in those that I use, you frequently see promotions and telephone numbers for the Samaritans. So talking about it does not give anybody the thought or the inclination. The next fiction is that suicide happens without warning. By definition, suicides are often impulsive acts. They can be born out of significant events, traumas of one sort or another, and we'll cover what some of those might be in a short while. But by and large, they don't happen without warning. As with many things in suicide, there aren't any hard and fast rules, but generally there are some indications. The most common is self-esteem, anxiety, concern, that kind of thing. So it is not necessarily true to say they happen without warning. Suicide people are mentally ill. Not true. They're unhappy, they're anxious, they're upset, but not all people who take their own life could be diagnosed as mentally ill. One of the other fictions is once a person is suicidal, he or she is suicidal forever. Well, no. They're generally suicidal for a limited period of time, and given the proper help and proper support, they can make full recovery. One of the other fallacies is that suicide people are committed to dying. Well, no, not always true. The overriding consideration, the overriding thought and emotion is ambivalence. They want to die, but they also want to live. They don't want to die, but neither do they want to go on living like this. And essentially, if you were to sum it up in a phrase, their basic desire is for the pain to stop. The final thought on the fiction session is that when a suicidal person begins to feel better, the danger is over. And I'm afraid it's not true, because the risk of suicide is very often at its height when a moment of depression passes, because the individual will appear to calm down. But the reality is that when you're in a deep depression, you very, very rarely have the mental capacity to take your own life. You don't have the thinking capacity, you don't have the physical capacity very often to do it. Once the depression lifts, then a strange sort of calm often descends. And very often that calm is because the person has decided that they're going to take their own lives, and a perverse kind of peace descends upon them, which can be translated as they're through this. we just need to be conscious that if a person starts to begin to feel better, the danger is not over. So let's go on to the next slide. Male suicide versus female. Well, as a generalization, 75% of suicides are men, and the received logic is that it is because men find it more difficult to talk about their emotions. There's actually been a piece of work recently out of Manchester University. It is only one study, but it casts doubt on whether that's a truism or not. And I won't give you all the stats, you can look them up if you want to, but let me quote to you the conclusion from the research. It says, "It is too simplistic to say that men do not seek help. We should focus on how services can improve the recognition of risk and respond to men's needs, and how services might work better together." And I think the emphasis there is on the word together. The figures are quite startling, in the sense that I think it said something like upwards of 60, maybe 70% of people had been in touch, of men who committed suicide had been in touch with a frontline service at some time prior to taking their own lives. Another thing that might account for the higher rate of male completed suicides is that men, because of their, and again, a bit of a generalization, but it's the violent impulsivity, which is often part of the male psyche, that leads to them choosing irreversible methods of suicide, jumping, hanging, shooting. And females would tend more often to choose death by overdose, thus sometimes giving them a chance to change their mind. Now, I must stress here that a lot more work needs to be done in this area. This is our best summation of what we see and what we hear, and what we're advised by the experts who guide us, and I'll mention those in a little more detail a little later on. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but the thing that should strike you about what can lead to suicidal thoughts and feelings is none of those events are extraordinary in their own way. They're the sort of thing that many people deal with on a day-to-day basis. There can be many, many contributors to suicidal feelings. And there are one or two there which one hopes are an exception, but in the main, a lot of them are circumstances with which many of you will be familiar. So if we can scroll through to the next slide. So why don't people ask for help? Well, there's a whole confidentiality thing. They want to keep the thoughts and inclinations to themselves. They have worries because they have worries about children being taken into care. They worry about it going on their work record. They worry about it affecting their job prospects. And of course, they fear that they may be locked up, that in worst case, they end up being sectioned. And then there's the whole stigma thing associated with suicide. And if we go to the next slide, part of it, I mean, there's a stigma generally, but then there's also the mental health stigma. This is the thing I referred to earlier, which people think, well, if you're tempted to take your life, you must be seriously mentally ill. One of the other barriers to seeking help are some of the other myths that were on a previous slide. And the final one is often the circumstances in which they find themselves are so challenging, they simply don't have the physical, mental, or emotional capacity to reach out. So let's scroll on to the next slide and see where that takes us. This is the section where I talk a bit more about the listening place. So it's a registered charity. We started work in October 2015 and opened our doors in July 2016. We have 2 premises in Pimlico. One is a set of NHS premises kindly provided to us by NHS premises and kitted out specifically for us, and that's at the Hunter Street Health Centre, which is near Rossiter Square Tube Station. And the other one is a Muse property, which we've converted, which is in Vauxhall Bridge Road. Unfortunately, these figures are a bit out of date. The demands at the moment are quite extraordinary. We've actually received over 10,000 referrals, 2/3 of which come from the NHS. And we trained over 800 volunteers, and I think we're looking at another 250 or so before the end of the year. It really is, the growth is alarming and deeply disturbing. And of course, we have all read acres of print about the after effects of COVID on mental health. So quite what the future holds for us, at the moment, we can only guess. Our referrals come from 32 London boroughs. I think we've had about 100 when I last looked from your part of the world. If we could just go back. I said that we were helped and guided by professionals because we're not. We're well-trained volunteers, but we're not mental health professionals. We're not there to provide a diagnosis. But we do have 10 mental health professionals on our board and our trustees who give up their time to help guide. They helped us develop training. They provide review sessions in the same way that professionals have review sessions. The listener finds it difficult to make headway with a particular visitor, and the supervisor similarly is running out of ideas, then there are regular review sessions when one or other of these professionals run clinics for us, for the listeners, where we can talk about the issues. And they give their time pro bono, as do all the volunteers. And we do evaluate our work, and I'll explain a little bit more about how we do that a little later on. So, I should probably say, and this plays to the issue about growth. One of the constraints, well, the 3 main constraints are: one is, can we get enough volunteers through the system and trained? And of course, during COVID, and lockdown, that was extremely difficult. The other is money, as ever it is with charities, and the third is space. And we're currently looking at opening a third set of premises in Hammersmith sometime in the new year, if everything goes to plan. So let's scroll on. So we're open 7 days a week, 9 to 9, 100 appointments a day. We're currently over 500 referrals a month, and it's increasing. The July figure was actually 559. And just to give you a sense of the growth, our forecast is for 5,200, and that can't be right. Because I know we've already had 10,000 referrals. But the important thing is that in year 1, the first year of our operation, we had 236 in the whole year. as opposed to we're getting double that each month at the present rate. So let's, oh, and of course, the crucial one, there are 1,000 people who we're currently supporting. So if we could move on. Our visitors are, and I guess this bears out what I earlier said wasn't necessarily true, that men have difficulty talking about their emotions because 61% of our visitors are female, 39% are male. For me, one of the most depressing things is that the largest cohorts are the 18 to 25 group, who make up 23%, and the 31 to 40 that make up 22%. That 23% is a very challenging number, and we are seeing a gradual increase in referrals from universities, as you would expect from that age group. So let's scroll on. Told you a little bit about our visitors. I said earlier, 65% now come from the NHS. I haven't broken the numbers down, but I'm guessing that's about 50% from A&E and 50% from GPs and related practitioners. 28% come from other charities, from universities, from the police, from the British Transport Police, from social services, housing associations. And there's a small number, 7%, who are self-referrals. And they do that by going online. And in fact, all the referrals come in online. There's a very comprehensive set of paperwork which an NHS practitioner is required to fill in. Gives us presenting symptoms, it gives us their assessment of their suicide risk, all the kind of stuff that we need to make a judgment about the kind of support that individuals need. So if we then scroll on from there, this is what happens. So we get a referral, and our first target, and I'm touching wood when I say this, but so far we are managing to meet our targets, we call within 24 hours. So the first contact is made within 24 hours. If the first one isn't successful, we'll go on trying, and we then try and offer the first appointment within a week. Now, the first appointment is an assessment, and not all volunteers are trained to do assessments. What happens there is the person comes in, and one of the smaller group who is assessment trained talks through the patient's history, talks through the visitor's circumstances, shares with them the kind of support and help that they can expect from the listening place. And then jointly we make a decision about whether it is the right place for them to be. And during that assessment, we also make our own assessment of their suicide risk. We use an internationally recognized assessment tool that helps us come to that judgment, and also put some measurements around how they're feeling. So we measure their suicidal ideation, we measure their level of distress, and crucially, we ask them how well overall they feel supported. If it's appropriate, i.e. if we feel that we can support the visitor, and if the visitor feels that we're able to fulfill what they expect from us, then they go straight to ongoing support for 3 months. And what they get is one 50-minute session every fortnight. And after 3 months, there is a review. So one of another small number of people that can do assessments and reviews sit in on the regular session. Now, this serves two purposes. The people that do assessments and reviews are generally, not exclusively, but genuinely more senior, more experienced. So sitting in on the session gives us an opportunity to observe the listener at work, to observe the chemistry between the two. And that's part of our ongoing assessment of our own people. But it also gives us a sense. So after the first half of the session, the regular listener leaves, the supervising volunteer then talks to the listener, questions which very much you'd expect. Are you getting the support that you need? Is the chemistry with your listener correct? Where would you like to go from here? Sometimes they're good to go. Sometimes we might give them a limited number of sessions, say 3. In other cases, we will say, okay, how about another 3 months support? After which there will be another review. In the review, the same measurements that were taken at assessment are logged, and that way we can get an overview of the progress that the individual has made, and we collate all that. And I think the research from the last few years is currently being peer reviewed. I'd have to check, but what it does show us, the headline is that it works. Sitting with people, talking to them works. And I think a lot of that is because, well, some of them it's the first time they've ever been listened to. But the comments they most often share with us, because obviously as part of the review, they're asked to fill in a questionnaire, which again gives us a sense of how they feel, gives us a sense about the level of service that we need to offer, gives us a powerful sense check about whether we're heading in the right direction and meeting all our targets. But the things that regularly come up in the review forms is, you've given me a safe place, a confidential space, and a non-judgmental space. And the combination of those 3 leads to some pretty significant results in helping them understand some of the issues around why they are where they are. So let's move on. So we've done a referral. The criteria for the referral are they have to be suicidal, and whether that's a mild ideation to a recent failed attempt. They have to be over 18. There are a whole, you will know better than me, that there are a whole raft of safeguarding issues in working with children. And we've not gone to that space. We've gone to the adult arena and deal only with 18-year-olds. The visitor must be able to access the premises for face-to-face support. Because, as I say, that's the core of what we offer. Goes without saying that we have a zero tolerance of drugs or alcohol. They must reach the threshold of the Mental Capacity Act. I think those are the main ones. Just take me on to the next slide just to make sure I haven't missed anything from the criteria. No, I haven't. Right. So those are the core criteria. The most important of which is, are you suicidal? Do you want to take your own life? And are you able to come in and see us face to face? Now, if the answer to the last one is no, then we don't just say, oh, well, that's tough. We have a book, yay thick, which we call the signposting manual, and all the other organizations that we know of that deal with everything from mental health to housing to benefits to you name it, telephone support, of course, even down to, why do I say even, including some specific issues like OCD or alcoholism, or they're all in the book, and the people will be signposted and given support to contact one of these other organizations. The confidentiality policy is absolute. The visitors are told from the moment they arrive that anything they say stays within the business. stays within the charity. Because of data protection, we have to put that to them explicitly, and then of course they have to sign that off. They have to say, yes, I am aware that you keep records. And the reason that we keep records is very, very simple. I suspect about 95% of the time we are able to give the visitors the same listener on each occasion, but just occasionally, it is a charity, stuff happens, somebody can't make their shift. It's so much easier if the person sitting in is able just to quickly go through the notes, familiarize themselves with the circumstances, because that means that the listener doesn't then have to repeat themselves all over again, feel that they'd not been listened to in the first place, otherwise you'd already know all this, the kind of things with which I'm sure you're terribly familiar. So the confidentiality policy is absolute. It's signed off explicitly. And the reasons are, well, the main reason is the one that I hinted at earlier, which is that people who are suicidal value the confidentiality as well as valuing the safe space and the non-judgmental space. And they talk, they share much, much more freely. So I'll take a sip of water, and if you could move on to the next slide, that would be great. Now, I touched on this earlier. So after 3 months and then 6 months, if the additional 3 months is extended, we see from the numbers that there is a significant reduction in suicidality and distress, and a highly significant increase in feeling supported. Intervention at moments of crisis can help people from taking their own lives. That's the other very obvious conclusion. And that's rewarding because that's what we're there to do. I have to be honest, we're not always successful. We have tragically lost a couple of people, but out of the 1,000 people that we're supporting at any one time, they are showing that a timely intervention, being listened to, being guided in their conversations, can prevent people from taking their own life. I think, just take a quick look at the next one, but I think that's probably the last slide. Yes, well, I just end with a quote that really says it all. This, obviously, I'm not going to give away the person's name, but it was in a presentation, not dissimilar to this, in a very alpha male audience. I mean, they were, let's start again. It was a mixed audience, but it was an alpha male culture and an alpha male profession that we were addressing. And somebody actually was brave enough to stand up and say in front of their colleagues precisely that. And that's as good as compliments get. Now, I'm sure there's lots of stuff that you'd wish I covered and haven't, in which case hopefully the website will answer those questions for you. It may even be stuff that I have covered which you thought, oh no, we haven't got to hear all this again, have we? We've had enough of that this month. But I hope that those moments were few and far between, and I hope you found it informative. So we've got a bit of time left. Let's take some questions if there are any.
I've just got a question. In terms of, I know you said it's reviewed after 6 months. After the 6 months, if you feel that the person still needs that support, do you still offer that support to the people?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
There's a very small number, I can't recall it, it's maybe 20 odd who've been with us a year or more. And these are people who are high risk. So we categorize our risks as no thoughts, low risk, medium risk, high risk. We make a judgment, and we actually ask the listener, the visitor, I'm sorry, what they judge their risks to be. Because in each and every session, we're unapologetic, albeit hopefully very, very gentle, about saying, are you still having thoughts of taking your own life? We don't duck the issue. That's central to what we do. And we warn them right up front at the first meeting. You will find that we will put this question to you time and time again, because as I say, it's the core of what we do. So no, 6 months is not the limit. We have a series of review criteria at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months about just how far we think we need to go. It'll be the individual's own circumstances. It will be whether or not they're in the system in some way, shape, or form and have alternative support. I suppose those are and the level of risk. So I suppose those are the three main considerations that we have to keep in mind. But it's an interesting question, and one that I will feed back. I'm sure it's part of the analysis. Of course, our 10 experts have views on this, and they're pretty unanimous about face-to-face being more effective. Indeed, the whole genesis of the charity was when the Samaritans changed their modus operandi and no longer would do face-to-face. That wasn't the only thing they changed, but it was one of the things they changed. And I suppose about 35% of our volunteers didn't agree with that decision. And some have joined us, some have continued to do both. What is interesting, it's a slightly tangential, but what we did recognize fairly quickly was that the impact that a remote consultation had on the listener. And that was because in normal circumstances, when they're doing face-to-face, at the end of the shift, they had a chance to decompress. It might just have been going up to the office, talking to the other listeners. It might have been their journey home, but there's an opportunity to process and decompress. When you do a remote session from your own home, you don't have that opportunity. If you live alone, you've nobody to talk to. If you live with somebody else, then generally speaking, you're expected / required to engage with friends, lovers, partners, children, or whomever. And so we tried to introduce a short Zoom session for the whole group, the whole shift afterwards, just to provide that 5 or 10 minutes when they can share views, share concerns, and just generally decompress before returning to normal life. But your point about what are the scores tell us for the 18 months that we were remote, and what did they tell us beforehand, is a very, very good one. Thank you for the suggestion. I shall feed that back in. No, I probably wouldn't be there if there was. No, I mean, I think there's a lower age limit of 18. I'm trying to think. I think the youngest we've got is early 20s. The oldest, I think there's somebody just had their 80th birthday. So no, all walks of life, all genders, any age. You just have to, 1, be committed. 2, you have to graduate. So you have to go through the training. It isn't automatic that once you start the training, you qualify at the end and you're welcomed into the fold. It isn't a high failure rate, I'm delighted to say, but it is explained that there are certain requirements that you need to meet. And equally, I mean, that might sound a little bit harsh. One of the things that puzzles me occasionally is that our volunteers are precisely that, they're volunteers. But we give them a contract to sign. They have a notice period. They have to notify us of leave in advance. And it's not automatic that they will either A, make it onto the listening team, and B, then progress through the subsequent training, or indeed the periodic reviews that go on during their time with us. And I think there's also a requirement. We do a ongoing personal development program, and we have, I think they're required to do 3 or maybe 4 additional sessions during the course of the year on mental health issues, all delivered by experts. So it's as rigorous as you can be if you're a charity, but I hope everybody realizes, including the audience today, that you kind of have to have an infrastructure. Some of what we do is fairly high risk. There is a requirement for continuity of care, and not everybody's ideally suited. I mean, if you came to the training and you were one of these people who are totally solutions focused, then we'd maybe encourage you that that wasn't the right way to be for the people that they're going to see. So no age limit, no serious barriers, just a commitment to the cause, the ability to observe some of the gentle structure, rules and regulations around what we do. And yeah, you can stay with us forever then. Oh gosh, all right, somebody's going to have to help me with the maths here, right? So because off the top of my head, so each site, there are 2 sites, each site does 3 shifts, and each shift will see roughly, let's say 4 volunteers, 4 times 3, 12. So they'll be seeing between 12 and 15 people in the course of the shift. And there'll be 3 shifts across 2 sites. And then there's an additional set of sessions out of King's College Hospital on a Sunday. And they probably do, I don't know, 5, 15, 30. They probably do about 45, 50 people.
How long is each shift?
Each shift is 9 till 1, 1 till 5, 5 till 9. So it's what, 4 hours, isn't it?
Yeah. And does each volunteer does 1 shift though? They're not expected to take on more than 1 client?
Well, I'm currently doing 2.
Okay.
But that's because of the pressure in the system.
Right.
And each person will see 3 people. They'll be rostered. They'll be scheduled to see 3 people in the shift. I say rostered because sometimes there are no shows. That's unfortunate given the pressure on the system, but that's one of the things that we do stipulate when our visitors come, that if you can't make it, we always send a text beforehand to remind them of when their shift is, that what their session is. And then we encourage them to let us know, because we can always make good use of that 50 minutes with somebody who needs us in an emergency.
Yeah, and I can now understand why there has to be a debriefing, because that's quite a lot of clients actually in that period as well.
Yes, it is, and it's part of the reason that the supervisor on the shift will probably only have 1 rostered session. That might be an assessment, it might be a review, it might be a client. The rest of the time, it's down to reading the reports that the listeners have written, sense checking whether they've made the right decisions around grading the risk, talking with them how they're feeling, because as you can imagine, there aren't many, put it this way, there aren't many aspects of life that we don't encounter, and the challenges of life that we don't encounter in these 50-minute sessions. And so, as I said right at the beginning, the well-being of the listeners is just as important as that of the visitors. Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, first of all, just giving them the opportunity to share it and letting them know that you're concerned and that you care is a huge, I'm sure you know, is a huge step forward. And helping them examine what that phrase, "I feel suicidal," means. And gently but unambiguously probe what it is they're talking about. And even sometimes as being, as I was going to use the word brutal, we're never brutal, but as precise as saying, "Are you telling me that you want to kill yourself?" And just putting it on the table helps them think through what their ideation is about and the consequences of following through. In practical terms, we will, wherever possible, signpost them to those agencies that are able to help. In extreme cases, if we feel that there's a significant deleterious effect on their mental health because of the circumstances, then we will, on occasions, write to, in some cases, their GP, just to add reinforcement to the person's plight and maybe help move the thing further forward a little quicker than normal. But I suspect I know where you're coming from, because it turns up frequently, and it isn't just the state of the housing. In some cases, it's harassment from neighbors, it's neighborhood drug dealing, it's feeling unsafe in your own environment, and insecure, which most people listening to this know insecurity lies at the heart of so many issues. So it is a very, very real problem. In terms of finding them a house, what can we do? Not a lot, but we can give them support. We can help them investigate their own feelings around suicide, and we can signpost them and occasionally give them some ammunition to move their case forward.